Yep. And I'll take a round of questions and then put them to the panel.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, my name is Gleda Lan. I'm from Chatham House in London. And as Mark and Michael know, we're working with DFID and UNHCR on an initiative, the Moving Energy Initiative, which looks at, there is actually some overlap. We look at changing the way that energy services are delivered in situations of displacement. And definitely our conclusions of in our report, which comes out next month, align with yours very, very clearly, especially in terms of that need for multi-year funding, some sort of fund that can enable sustaining large, infrastructure investments over time. And I wanted to know, because I want to pick up on something that Paul said, in terms of if you see humanitarian organizations shifting to become also, major procurers, regulators of these kind of services, where do you think accountability can be best situated? Or do you have any examples of where that can work? If you're working with private sector companies, big and small, putting in place energy and water infrastructure in a highly insecure context, how can you ensure that the best methods of accountability? And the other question linked to that, I know I've said it to Michael before, but kind of controversial. Do you think there's ever a case in which the humanitarian system is part of the problem in sustaining services just above the level, that is possible to allow life to continue, when the real problem, comes from continual bombardment in an asymmetric conflict?
Great, thank you. Others? Yeah, Sandrine.
Hi, I'm Sandrine from MSF. No, thanks very much for this really interesting report. I guess my question is really, I really like this graph that you put, which really made me think immediately of Yemen, which is one of the places right now where we're seeing, this incredible destruction of infrastructure and real kind of, massive degradation of the standard of living for people. But how do you, we've also seen in Yemen a total fragmentation of power and different areas being held by different groups. So how do you avoid, supporting municipal services and maintaining your neutrality and, not being seen as being, part of the, one group or another in this kind of context?
Great. Other questions? Comments? Yeah, go for it.
In the introduction, you mentioned that communities do develop their own coping strategies, which go beyond survival to adapting to their new normals. And I'm wondering, how do you see this within the new shift in the paradigm you're proposing? How to engage with this, especially as mentioned, when in some cases local governments are part of the conflict itself?
Great. I think, why don't we start there, and then I'll do another round. So, excuse me, Paul, should we go to you first for that first question?
Sure. And a great question, because it gives me a chance to talk a little bit about one of the things that I didn't manage to work into my allotted time, was this new paradigm should also give us the opportunity to do better those things that are a bit underdone now. And I'm thinking specifically in this area, the idea of project planning and prioritization. Everything is done first in, first out. You do what you can because you're busy and there's limited money and that sort of thing. So, the new paradigm needs to allow for a more sane allocation of resources. It needs to allow also for something that we don't find way to work in now, is risk analysis and mitigation, so that rather than replacing the thing that keeps getting knocked over, we're doing more analysis of systems in conjunction with the system owners, so that we are identifying critical vulnerabilities and being able to prioritize that. That sets a superior framework for accountability than what we have now, where it's kind of truck and chuck. We'll put these hygiene kits on the truck and they go over there and they get offloaded and we're told they reach beneficiaries, and gee, we sure hope they do. The type of context that we're talking about is one where the accountability risks are very, very high, probably to at or beyond donor tolerance levels. I mean, it's only the magnitude of the humanitarian suffering that allows it to happen. If we have a more structured system, which is more closely streamlined within ourselves, with better planning, better risk analysis, better contract management, I think our accountability context is enhanced. Where the accountabilities would exactly positioned is probably something that you'd need to think through in the sort of the detailed design of the new paradigm. But I think from an accountability point of view, we're much stronger. Maybe I should leave the other part of the question with respect to maintaining services at or above sustainable levels to someone else, or I'll have a go at it if you like.
Sounds good. Great. We'll see if there's time. So over to Michael and Mark. I think this first question about whether humanitarianism is part of the problem, and then the question that Sandrine raised about engaging with municipal services, does it jeopardize neutrality?
So, in terms of what Gladys said, we do obviously see extensive destruction of infrastructure, so the direct impact. And we see it on an increasing scale to the extent that, the Icrc released a report in March called Bled Dry that to a certain degree documents that, but then moves beyond that and really starts to talk also about these indirect impacts and the difficulties in terms of providing the support to the service providers. And here, the overwhelming focus is the focus on repairing and rehabilitating infrastructure that has been damaged, the direct damages. But much less has actually focused on those longer term impacts, because the system that's in place is not conducive for allowing us to really work on a longer term time frame to deal with those indirect and cumulative impacts. And I think, I would echo a little bit about what Lucy said. The Icrc has actually worked a little bit beyond its traditional mandate in countries like Jordan and Lebanon with the refugee crisis. And the main reason for that is that we've found that we have the skills in terms of working with service providers that are just as applicable in those contexts as they are in Syria. The range of challenges that you face are slightly different, but at the same time building those strong relationships and helping service providers respond to be it direct or indirect impact is really what is at the core of the effort. And then in terms of Yemen in particular, it's not only Yemen that we see this in. In a lot of the securitized or politicized conflicts in the region and even outside, even in the Ukraine, these are huge challenges that need to be overcome. And it's not a cookie cutter approach. The Icrc approach has been basically to go cross lines for the most part and not cross borders. And in that cross line work, basically, we've drawn upon the fact that we've had a long-standing relationship with many of the water boards. So in Yemen, we've had a presence for decades. And in terms of the water and habitat work, almost a decade. And so previous to the onset of the civil unrest in 2011, March 2011, we were there. And we continued throughout the period of civil unrest until the actual larger scale war in March kicked off, which provided us a particular vantage point in terms of the relationships that we had developed with the water boards to be able to withstand periods of time where potentially safe access is not guaranteed. And there, working with them and prioritizing basically the types of consumables and spare parts that are needed, as well as the repair work that needs to be done, and extending that to the electrical services beyond just, you know, the classical response of providing generators, but actually engaging in some of the more electrical side of the equation, has proven to provide some resilience to these service providers. But at the same time, it needs to be significantly upscaled in these protracted conflicts.
Can I just follow back on that based on Sandrine's question? I mean, so you have these experiences of these long-term relationships with water boards and with these municipalities. As you see a context shift, as a conflict emerges or changes, have you ever had to have those decisions or discussions around, is this now putting us in violation of neutrality, or how do we assess neutrality as a situation changes over time?
So at the center of the approach are the victims of armed conflict. And they're in areas that are either controlled by armed non-state actors or controlled by government. It's always a negotiated process with all the parties to a conflict to be able to gain access to those areas. Now, from our experience, the local water board staff, and what Mark so aptly referred to in his presentation, are the ones that have the extensive experience that we need to draw upon and hopefully keep them there and not have this brain drain. They're the same people typically that were there prior to, the same technical people that were there prior to territory changing hands. And so typically the neutrality is less put into question in terms of those long-term relationships that we've had with water boards. And primarily, I would say, that's also because of the diversification in terms of the funding streams that they traditionally get. Depending on the conflict that you see, you could have a continuation of funding that comes from the central government, but also you could have cases where funding comes from other sources. Possibly it could be the population in terms of paying for the services is what in part keeps those technical staff in place to be able to continue to work with.
And then Mark, quickly on the coping strategies, perhaps?
Yeah, sure, and thanks for the question about coping mechanisms and how that feeds programming or how it might inform programming or perpetuate the conflict or the suffering. Yeah, certainly there are some examples of negative coping mechanisms, which is somewhat counterintuitive. A classic example is when people install household level booster pumps, suction pumps to suck the water out of the distribution pipes because there's not enough pressure in the system. And when you suck it in, the water is more likely to be contaminated, and therefore you risk diseases and therefore spreading diseases. And so a household level ingenious coping mechanism can actually be a threat to other people or to the people involved in the coping mechanism who have initiated it. How do you work that into programming? Well, as everyone has said, there's no cookie cutter approach, but I think certainly the magnitude of the challenge in urban areas and protracted conflict, as Paul said, forces us to relax a bit on accountability, perhaps. It challenges our neutrality, and it also obliges all of us actors to critically question our own programming, which sometimes might involve supporting communities in one neighborhood at the expense of other neighborhoods. And the first people or first group of people that knock on our door shouldn't be the only ones that we're focused on just because there's what appears to be a successful program. And what might work in a rural area certainly would have negative consequences in another neighborhood within the same city. So it obliges, the magnitude of the challenge obliges us to take a harder, critical look at our own programming and to avoid such negative coping mechanisms.
It'd be great to hear more about how to make those balances and decisions, but let's take a couple other questions, and there's also some coming in from the internet. I saw this hand up right before we closed.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks very much, everyone. It's great. My name is Richard Luff. I'm an independent humanitarian consultant. And it's really a question I'd like to address both to Michael and to Paul about this sort of paradigm shift. I did a piece of work last year, global piece of work for the WASH actors, humanitarian WASH actors, in which I undertook some visits to a number of countries, one of which was Lebanon, and I was speaking to a deputy of one of the water authorities, water utilities in the east of the country, and he spoke to me about the strength of ICRC programming, and cited ICRC really as the only organisation that was delivering for him in a significant, predictable, long-term way. And I've worked in humanitarian crisis for many years, and it's been very much my experience as well. So I think for me, ICRC is undoubtedly the only traditional humanitarian actor who can deliver predictably on large-scale urban infrastructure work. Others can do it from time to time, but not predictably. So this got me thinking about a question. So what is it about ICRC? What is it that ICRC does in the way they do it? And how much of this can be replicated by other actors as part of this sort of paradigm shift? Can other actors, whether it's sort of UN agencies, international NGOs, other parts of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, really replicate some of this to be able to do better urban infrastructural WASH work? I reached a conclusion on that. I won't share that here, but I wondered for you, in terms of the sort of this need for a paradigm shift, and Paul sort of alluded to tinkering, whether the traditional humanitarian actors can make the change themselves, or do they need to do something different?
Great question. Others from the room? Oh, yep, two in the back there.
Hi, my name is Clémence Minaz. I work at International Alert. It's a peace-building NGO. I work as research associate for the Environment, Climate Change and Security team. And I wondered if during the research you tried to look at low-intensity conflict impact on one of the key urban services you mentioned, which is people, and how, for example, gang violence or land security, land tenure conflict impact people's ability to move, for example, or to access a healthcare center, for example. And because that clearly impact the targeting of the humanitarian intervention. And I wanted to know if you looked at these low-intensity conflict issues.
Hi there, my name's Eve McKinnon. I'm independent WASH advisor, but I've worked with MSF and Oxfam. Just a quick question, really. It was just on kind of the scope of the report. I notice it just focuses a lot on the Middle East, and I wondered whether kind of Central African countries also with less infrastructure to kind of repair, but also have huge urban populations. And also that kind of helps with the migration that's fueled from those areas as well. Thank you.
Great. And since we're running short on time, I'm going to add this question from the online participants, which I think is a good one about change. What do the panelists believe would be the most useful outcome on urban/conflict, so urban or urban conflict at the World Humanitarian Summit, if anything? Is it about bridging development and humanitarian silos, or some specific aspect of localization, or something else? And that's from Howard Mullett from CARE. So perhaps we could start actually by putting that question, since Lucy Earle, you are very closely engaged with the World Humanitarian Summit process. Perhaps we put that question to you first before addressing the rest of the questions.
Thanks, Alice. Yes, in terms of the World Humanitarian Summit and what the most important outcome might be, I think in general discussions are really ramping up on the way in which, particularly in protracted crises, that we can ensure that development actors and development perspectives are used from the start. And I think that would be, but on the urban side of things, this is precisely what we're trying to achieve through the summit. And we're considering the idea of an alliance of urban and other actors, recognizing that at present, the sort of dialogue between humanitarians, urban planners, engineers, municipal authorities just isn't happening. There isn't a place for that to happen. And I think that we recognise within the group that finding a way of getting that conversation happening at the policy level and then also at the country level would be a great outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit. So that's definitely something that we're working towards. And I think that if we can get this shift in behaviour, sort of to coin an ALNAP phrase, to move from the comprehensive approach where humanitarian agencies have a tendency to think that they're working from a blank slate and move to a more collaborative approach where they're more supportive of existing systems and building and working with those. I think that's part of the same discussion around developmental perspectives, and I think that would be a fantastic outcome if we could get that from the World Humanitarian Summit.
Great, thank you very much. I think I'll turn now to Michael and Mark, how you want to deal with the questions coming out about the report about ICRC. How is it doing it differently? What's the secret ingredient in the ICRC recipe? Low intensity conflict, how you dealt with that issue, and then the scope of the report. So over to you.
So yeah, thanks for the question, Richard. I think it's a very valid one and one that will, as this process moves forward, we will increasingly have to come back to. There's some inherent strengths that the ICRC has in terms of its specific mandate and the principles that the ICRC has in terms of being able to gain access to areas. With that also comes some additional flexibility in terms of the funding that we have, as well as the logistical capacity and the speed in which we can implement. And looking at over the last 30 years, the response that's basically been formulated and develops with time and has to be strongly rooted within a context-specific setting, we would see, we see fewer actors that are actually engaged on the same scale. We see, though, actors that do have, kind of historically speaking, developed a strong strength in terms of WASH response that could be just as applicable in urban areas in protracted armed conflicts as they are elsewhere, for instance, in natural disasters or refugee crises. But there also has to be this self-reflection within organizations in terms of how risk averse they are and how willing they are to actually be within the actual conflict zone itself and go across front lines to be able to provide services with the water boards, for instance, in various areas. And I think this goes back to Paul's point that at the same time, even very strong service providers that have a lengthy experience, shifting to an emergency context cannot be simply overwhelmed by a multitude of actors. So it needs to be a coordinated effort that we look at, but one that obviously today ICRC alone, or ICRC and the few other actors that we see in these contexts providing support to services, be it UNICEF or Oxfam or others, really it's not enough. There needs to be an upscale in terms of the type of the approach basically that we actually provide and the assistance that's provided.
And I'll address I guess the question about low intensity conflict was, to what extent did we address it in the report, and how does it feed into population displacements? We in the report we talk about population displacements primarily in terms of the impact upon public health levels, or the expected impact on public health. Of course, if you introduce all sorts of people into a new context, there are heightened risks of the spread of communicable diseases. But we refrained from beginning to look at the influence of, for instance, conflicts over energy or natural resources upon the actual political conflict itself, except to say, and if you remember the cumulative impact diagram that Michael showed, there was an arrow going back up that we know that degraded services increase social tensions because of disparity of a more scarce resource, or because of public health risks or what have you. We don't know exactly why or how, but we know they're there, but we haven't explored it in greater depth in the report. We're actually doing so in different venues and in different ways. We'd be interested to learn what International Alert has to say about this. Thanks.
Maybe quickly on the last question that was asked. When you get a chance to read the report is not intended to be Middle East centric. So there will be other case studies in there. It's unfortunate that I'm the one for the Icrc that's speaking to you right now, because I happen to have spent the last 10 years in the Middle East, and so I keep drawing on Middle East case studies. But you'll see from the infographic that a lot of this work also was underpinned by work that was being done in Afghanistan, in the Balkans as well, in Africa, large-scale settings like Goma, but also in Burundi, Libya, Mali, and many other contexts that long predate my involvement in humanitarian work, but that go back to some of the colleagues that we have here that have been around for 30 years, and some of those are brought out in this report.
Great, thank you. Just to wrap up then, just taking 1 minute max each, I want to put the same question that Lucy answered to the three panelists here, which is about this issue of change. So what kind of outcome would we want to see at the World Humanitarian Summit on this topic, or put a little bit differently, given the title of this event, what needs to change? What is the number one change that you would like to see to improve assistance to affected people in protracted urban conflict? And we'll start down there with you, Mark.
Yeah, I guess if we're going to have a change in paradigm, we have to rewire our own brains. And so that means rethinking questioning everything we think of. And I think Paul put it really well when he said we have to recognize that there are non-emergency humanitarian responses. I mix up humanitarian and emergency all the time, but I'm totally convinced now that if you're a humanitarian actor, you're not just in it for the acute conflict, you're in it for the long term, as long as there are humanitarian needs to fulfill. So I'm rewiring my brain. I hope everyone can, and that will eventually lead to funding structures that reflect that.
Great, thank you. Michael?
Yeah. I would go back to stressing basically a common understanding or recognition of the significance of the indirect impact, and then the understanding of the cumulative impact. And in that, I think, again, Paul had alluded to it, that this idea of risk mitigation is something that really needs to be taken forward. And that shift then is from more of a reactive mode of response to a proactive mode of response. And that is something I think that we owe to those in terms of the victims of armed conflict, but also to the service providers who are going out in the field on a daily basis to be able to move beyond this reactive mode in protracted conflicts. It's a responsibility that we have, that we build the knowledge that's necessary of the context, and we come in with the technical experience and the logistical experience to be able to provide longer term solutions, both for the service providers, but then ultimately for those that are affected by the service decline that we see. And that then obviously relates back to both the public health and the displacement issues that we talked about.
Great, thank you. And Paul, last word on change.
We need to move. We're stalled. It's interesting. 3 years ago this month, we had a Global WASH Cluster meeting in Nairobi, where we dedicated an additional day to WASH in urban emergencies. Philippe Dross, who's in the audience here, presented at that some of the material later found its way in the report. It was quite clear. Two things. One, that the ICRC had the leadership that Richard just described, and B, the rest of us had the willingness to do it, but not much of a clue about how to put that willingness to work. We're 3 years down the track. We have a better case. for what we already knew. Now, really, it is time to stop dancing with the new paradigm and actually make some tangible progress.
Great. Fantastic. A good call to arms at the end. Great. So thank you very much to Lucy, to Paul, to Mark, and to Michael for a fantastic set of presentations and answers. I think in the report, the ICRC mentions that it learns by doing, and I think we've all benefited by learning indirectly and directly from your experience today and the rich analysis that it's produced. So there is kindly, the ICRC has offered us a drinks reception immediately after this event, so we're all invited to go out and continue the discussion further. And in the meantime, please join me in thanking the ICRC for sharing this learning with us and our panelists for providing such a rich discussion. Thank you very much.